University. And she's looking at the prevalence of the impact of harassment on women and marginalised genders in UK esports, a very interesting topic. I'm going to pass this over to you, Jess, and I'll be back with you later on for any questions.
Great stuff. I just wanted to quickly say thanks to the Esports Research Network for the opportunity to present my work, as well as their hard work that's gone into running this event. I've really enjoyed it so far. So yeah, my name's Jess, and I'm a researcher at Leeds Beckett University, and today I'm going to take you through one of my research projects that I did for my PhD that looked at the prevalence and impact of harassment on women and marginalised genders within the UK esports scene. So it kind of started off from my a research project before this from PhD, which was an umbrella review that looked at the factors that affected performance and participation among esports players. So we found sleep issues, nutrition issues, those sorts of things. But the main thing that came out of it was the fact that there wasn't many women or marginalised genders in the research across the board. They weren't represented at many levels within any of the research papers. And when they were, most of it focused on their experiences of harassment and discrimination that they faced as potential reasons for limited participation. But beyond that, we don't know much else. So what do we know about harassment and esports? From the research that already exists, we know that hostilities and harassment towards women in esports can actually affect their abilities to fully engage and invest themselves in the industry, which also may impact on their participation and performance. When we look at more broader gaming and streaming, women are more likely to receive derogatory and sexual comments online than men, which also may help cause them to disengage. And this is typically caused by the anonymous nature of online gaming and esports. And then when we look at harassment as a whole, it does have a significant negative impact on a person's mental health, their self-esteem, and their kind of passion for their work. So it's understandable why we might not see as many women within this research area, as well as the industry as a whole. However, we don't have much empirical research on how harassment actually impacts women's performance and participation in esports. Most of what we have is qualitative research and anecdotal accounts, which is really great for getting those insightful takes. There's the understanding that these things are really impactful for women and marginalised genders, but we don't actually know the extent of the issue. And until we know that, we don't know, is harassment the main thing that is disengaging women and marginalised genders? Is there something else? How bad is it? So this kind of research came to address that. Now, when we look at the broader issues, there is a high prevalence of discrimination and harassment across the board within just general society, but in sport as well, traditional sports. So women in football found that from 2020 to 2023, there was a 66% to 83% in rise in the discrimination that women in football face, and that was people that worked in football, that were players themselves. So there is a rising issue with harassment and discrimination. When we look at performance engagement in general gaming, it's been found that sexual and genital harassment has contributed to women's disengagement from playing games. And then when we look at gender identity, we're seeing a lot more women and marginalised genders using ambiguous or gender-neutral gaming tags. So they're not identifiable by gender. And in that, they're also reluctant to use microphones for the fear that they might be harassed online. And we don't know to what extent this may actually impact on their sense of self as a woman or marginalised gender within the esports industry, and if it can potentially impact how they perceive themselves. So the aim of the study was to kind of address a lot of these issues. So initially it was to look at the overall frequency of harassment that women and marginalised genders experienced, look at if it can predict dropout intentions, if there's any associations between time loss, so any time that's taken away from training or participation or competition, if there's any associations between how they rated their own performance and harassment, understanding if there's any relationships between gender identity, their sense of self, and harassment, and then also to look at if there's any particular game or genre that might actually incur the most, like the high proportions of harassment across the esports industry. So a cross-sectional prevalence and burden study was used, and this was like an online survey that was distributed online, but also at esports and gaming events. Participants were currently competing women or marginalised genders. Now, when I say marginalised genders, I mean transgender men, transgender women, non-binary people. They had to be based in the UK and they were 18 years or above. And the questions that were included were around like the frequency of harassment on a weekly basis, their kind of self-rate performance, their best performance, their intentions to drop out, and their perceptions of their gender identity on their sense of self. So what we found, we got 30 participants, which is a small sample. It is exploratory in nature, this project. But when we look at the population, the sample for women and marginalised genders within the UK esports scene, it was estimated to be around 10% of that population. Mean participation around 8 hours a day. Participants competed for around an average of 3 years. The participation level was between casual, so casual in terms of it was recreational, but they might compete once or twice, to professional players that were working at an international level. And the top genres were dominated by shooters, so that was typically Valorant and Overwatch 2. MOBAs was typically League of Legends, and sports games included like EFC and Rocket League. Now, in terms of the results, we found that 93% of the participants experienced harassment at least once a week. And as well as that, 90% of them reported that they believed they performed worse at least some of the time following harassment. So the majority of people experienced harassment, and the majority of people felt it impacted their game in some way. And that created a moderate negative association between harassment and self-rated performance. So the more harassment, the worse they felt they were doing. But interestingly, when we get to dropout intentions, we found a moderate negative association between dropout and harassment. So while harassment seems to be really bad, it's not actually affecting their ability to engage with the esports industry. They're still here, they're still training, they're still competing. We did also find an interesting gender difference. Now, this isn't a significant difference, but it's an interesting insight. And we found that transgender players showed a slightly higher intention to drop out compared to cisgender players. In terms of time loss and burden, we found that just over a third of the participants took time away from training, from competition, specifically due to the harassment that they experienced. We also found that on average, there were around 182 instances of harassment in a 12-month period for the players. So essentially, a player could be harassed or discriminated against once every 2 days, essentially. And of the third of the players that took time away, around 16 days were lost. So they weren't training, they weren't competing, they were completely away from the environment, which can also impact on performance outcomes and also just the general participation. Once you're out of the scene, you might find it difficult to return to that. And then the incidence per 1,000 hours of training competition was 627. So within a 1,000-hour period of training and competition, there would have been around 627 new instances of harassment that a player might face. But then when we look at gender identity, we found no significant relationship between harassment and their perceptions towards their gender identity and how it impacted their sense of self. So, despite the possibility, from what we know from anecdotal research, anecdotal accounts, and qualitative research, there is a lot of gender-based harassment, a lot of things that target women directly, marginalised genders directly, but it doesn't seem to be actually impacting how they feel about themselves as women, as trans people. However, there was a slight difference, not significant, but again, really insightful to know. But transgender players felt more strongly about how important gender was to their sense of self compared to cisgender players. So there is that importance about, being who you are in this community and being recognised in this community as well. And then when we look at harassment and game genre, of the 20% of players that competed in MOBAs, 100% of them reported experiencing harassment. The 70% of shooter players experienced harassment, 95% of them experienced harassment, and then the 10% of sports game players, it was around 66%. But interestingly, the players that took time away, players from shooting games were more likely to take time away than MOBAs and sports games, with 38%, just over a third for MOBAs, and then no players from the sports games actually took time away. So it creates an interesting insight into, there may be more occurrences of harassment in MOBAs, but is there something more towards shooters possibly being a bit more toxic that are causing players to step away for a longer periods of time, or actually taking away full stop? However, take that with a grain of salt, because these weren't significant associations between game genre harassment or time taken away. These are just insights that we can delve deeper in at another period of time. But it's just interesting to know. Now, as we are wrapping up, this project was exploratory in nature, and it acted as the first attempt at empirically exploring the prevalence and burden of harassment on women and marginalised genders. So it acted as that foundation for more research in this area to occur, and a better understanding of how harassment and discrimination may affect performance and participation on women and marginalised genders. It also contributes to growing the research around women and marginalised genders in esports, and highlighting their experiences that are data-driven within the esports industry that is overrepresented by cisgender men in the esports literature, as well as the industry as a whole. When we think about the fact that, there is a 50-50 split between gamers now in terms of gender, we're still not hearing much about the experiences and the performance outcomes and the participation for women and marginalised genders. So it's really helping build that literature a little bit more. And it also highlights the extent of harassment experienced and the impact it can have on time taken away from competition and practice, as well as self-rated performance. Now, in terms of future directions, we didn't necessarily examine a specific harassment type. It was just the broad definition of what harassment is. So there is an opportunity to look at if there's any specific types of harassment that is occurring or impacting on players more. Is there issues with sexual harassment? Is it just general harassment? And we also didn't look at the sources of harassment either. So is it all anonymous online, or is it coming from players? Is it coming from coaches? Is it coming from peers? We can start to kind of break down where these issues lie and where we need to start focusing our attentions to get women and marginalised genders getting more involved in esports and feeling safer in the industry. This research also presents the opportunity to apply this to other countries and cultures. Is it just the UK esports that's high in harassment, but they've also got reasonably low dropout rates, or is that across the board? Is there differences? I think there's a great opportunity to see if there is any differences across the board or if there's anything similar. And we also focused on self-rated performance. I think it'd be interesting to see if it actually impacts on actual performance. So is it actually impacting on their ability to win games or complete tasks within their games? Or is it just they feel that harassment is affecting them more? So that would be an interesting place to look as well. And that's me. Thank you for listening.
Oh, perfect. Thank you very much, Jessica. There's loads of questions, so I'm going to have to go through three, and then I'm going to ask you if you can kindly look through the chat afterwards to answer any questions and just type them down. The gaming chair disappeared today, though. I can't see it today. But first one that I wanted to look at was in relation to I'm just going back up to the chat now. Has this been looked at? How much time is lost due to teammates ruining the games, like friendly fire? This is one that came up quite a lot, which was there's obviously a lot of toxicity within games, and I think that's apparent based on gender and non-gender aspects behind it. So do you think there is an impact in terms of friendly fire versus opposition?
Potentially. I don't have those pieces of data to hand, but I also have conducted another piece of research that's piggybacked off the back of this, and it's found that like there are issues within communities as well that may also affect people's ability to get engaged and participate in their communities. So potentially, but I'm not entirely sure.
No problem at all. Like I said, I'm not expecting you to know all the answers to these because your presentation was very in-depth as it was. The next one was looking at the fact of identity and identifying approaches in terms of this and what experiences people got with that. Someone highlighted, I was over 30 before I understood studying bias. I felt it was it as unfair, but did not have the words for it. So can they actually identify why they are being, why are they leaving, like why are players leaving in relation to it? Can they understand, like, are they getting a particularly higher bias than other player groups? Are they able to identify that?
Again, this was more like the empirical insights, so we don't actually know why they left or why they dropped out in general. But again, from the research that we've conducted afterwards, there is a stereotype bias there in terms of women might not necessarily get trials for teams or competitions because the second that the team finds out that they're a woman, they make excuses why they can't join the team. So there is a stereotype bias there of they might not get into those pathways to begin with.
Perfect. And then I think this is my last question. This is my question in terms of, and I'm sneaking and chucking one of my questions in here. But the thing that I wanted to sort of look at was when I know you said that don't focus on the data about FPS, MOBA, and sports games, but it's something that I thought was quite interesting, which is FPS games require players to have voice comms working in terms of casual play, especially more at the amateuristic level, where the vast majority of players, I'm assuming in your research, were conducted from. MOBA games and sports games do not require that. So do you think there is a more emphasis on communication through voice, or people shouting or being blatantly racist, homophobic, sexist, etc., than having it through a text-augmented sort of process.
Yeah, definitely. That was one of the main things I thought was one of the key points that came out of that, because like you say, the FPS games, you do need more verbal communication, and some of that can feel probably a lot more personal than reading like a toxic chat. So that might be a reason why players were more likely to take time away, because it does feel more personal when it's coming from a person vocally rather than verbally than just text.
Perfect. Actually, because you finished slightly early, I can ask you the last question that I can see sort of coming up at the moment, which is, and I think it's interesting because we've just talked about safeguarding in terms of data, and there's been quite a few talks on safeguarding, so I thought what this one would be quite good to ask you, which is what safeguarding could organisations put out there in place to lower chances of these incidences, and how to best deal with them, because I'm sure when you did your study you looked at the Riot Games sort of harassment policy, etc., and a range of other ones. So do you think these are good enough, and what can be done to remove or try to eliminate it even further?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a zero tolerance approach to the harassment occurrences. Like I said, we don't know exactly if it's coming from the teams or the orgs themselves, or if it's just coming from online anonymous play, which again is an interesting area to look at. But we also know that there is peer bullying and harassment in the industry. There is coach harassment in the industry. So it's ensuring that there is a code of conduct that is enforced, and if there are any breaches of that, then it needs to be addressed immediately.
100%. I think that is the last question from the chat. There's a few probably that you can see will pop up in terms of it. I thought this was quite an interesting point, and I've been reading up a lot recently because we've been going into the next Game Changer season for Valorant, which is probably the most well-known women in non-binary competition. But there's been a lot of posts by the players on Twitter, which obviously is not, or X, better known as, a great place to realistically look, but from an ethnographic point of view at least, about coaches being harassing team members as well in terms of this quite heavily. So the research is fantastic. I can't remember if you had your PhD the last time we spoke, so that, congratulations on that, because I've just realised that's come through as well. And yeah, thank you very much, Jessica. We'll be going to